To turn it on tonight. I'm getting better at this. Practice makes perfect, right? You know, we have spent the last few sermons talking about words that should be a part of the day-to-day Christian life. We talked last week, Sunday morning and Sunday evening, about the idea of grace, about what it means to us, how we are found in it, what it gives us in our life, and what it is not at times as well. We talked this morning about the idea of courage, and we looked at the need to have courage in our life, where that courage is going to come from, and how it will benefit us. And part of what we looked at is the idea that we have to have courage to confront sin in our own lives and in the lives of those that we love. It is not an easy thing to do. It is not a fun thing to do, but it is something that God requires of us. And it is something that when we love somebody, we will do. Tonight, I want to look at the idea of what sin is. It's a word that comes up in most of the lessons that we talk about, and I'm not really going to get down into the specifics of this is sin and this is not, and lay it out as far as the do's and the don'ts, but really what the meaning of sin is and how it affects us and how it affects our relationship with God and what the cure for sin in the world is today. I want to start by reading Romans chapter 7. We're going to start in verse 13. Did that which is good then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin producing death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. Paul said it wasn't the good stuff that God brought into my life. It wasn't the good stuff of His creation that caused me to be separated from Him or that caused me to die, but it was sin that entered into the world. And then he goes on to talk about this inner struggle that he is having, and it's a struggle that if most Christians are honest with themselves about, we can relate to. That desire to please God, that desire to do the law and to understand and to live according to God's plan versus that desire of the flesh at times. Sometimes we're desiring to do what God says, but we find ourselves over here doing something completely opposite instead. And it's this back and forth we see here starting in verse 14. If I can find it. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. He said, I know that I should be a spiritual creature. I know that I am a spiritual creature. I know that's the way God created me. But I live in the flesh, and I have sold my flesh to sin in the past. For I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law, and that is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I, but it is sin that dwells within me. We see Paul going back and forth with himself here, and he's explaining this relationship with the spiritual being in the flesh. He said, I have every desire to live according to God's law, yet I find myself continually breaking God's law. I have every desire to do what is right in the sight of God, yet I find myself transgressing the law and sinning, and it is sin that is overtaking my life when that happens. It is not the spiritual being that is living, it is the flesh that is living at that time. And Paul is going here to tell us that there's a cure for that. There's an answer. I will continue while in this body, he says, to fight against the flesh. I'm going to have those desires and I'm going to struggle. But I will overcome. Sin in its most basic sense, I mean, just the literal meaning of it is to miss the mark. And I'm sure we've all heard that at times, to come up short. To have something that is the goal and to miss that goal. It is the word that we see in Judges chapter 20, starting in verse 15. From the cities of that day, the sons of Benjamin were numbered 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who were numbered 700 choice men. So we see 26,700 people here. Of all these people, 700 choice men were left-handed. So all the rest are right-handed. The 700 choice men are left-handed. Each one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. He said the smallest of margin, they were not going to miss. They weren't going to sin. They weren't going to err in where they were hitting. There was a target there, and they were going to hit it absolutely every single time. If they would miss that mark, that's what sin is. Just the understanding, it does not matter how far you miss it. If you miss it, you miss it. But in a spiritual sense, the literal meaning is just to miss the mark. In a spiritual sense, it is much broader. It is the understanding that there is universal spiritual failure. It's Paul. If we look at him, we see somebody that in our eyes we look up to as a Christian. He is this great and powerful Christian in the early church. He wrote so much of the New Testament. He delivered the gospel to so many people. He changed so many lives, starting with his own. Yet, he admits readily that he sins and that he struggles with the flesh, and that sin has at one point in time separated him from God, and that he will no longer allow it to do so. Romans chapter 3, verse 23, right before what we read here. We just read in chapter 7, moving back to chapter 3, Paul says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. When he says the word all, he uses it for a purpose. He wants the people reading this to know. He wants us to know. He wants everybody for all time to realize that I'm in that category. He's going to go on to tell us that he is the chief of all sinners, that he struggles with sin. He said, I want you to realize, Romans chapter 3, verse 20, because the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For through the law comes the knowledge of sin. He said, all you're going to get by living the law, trying to do the law, and looking at it day and day is to realize that you can't do it. It's a realization that sin is going to enter into your life or already has. See, since that garden, it has affected each and every one of us. Everybody that we love in some way struggles with sin. Nobody is immune from the consequences of sin on this earth. You see those that are strongest in the church in our eyes. You see those that are weakest in the church in our eyes. And what they have in common is sin. Some of us are better at hiding it than others. Some of us are honestly better with not struggling with it. But I promise you, there is a struggle somewhere there. I may not see it. You may not see it. But Satan does. And God does. We will struggle against sin. And the very understanding that the more you understand the law of God, the more you understand His will, the more you understand His words, the more you realize that we miss the mark. That we do not always appear as the aroma of Christ to the world. That we do not always walk according to the light. That we find ourselves at times walking in the darkness. Paul goes on in Romans chapter 5, verse 13, for until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed when there is no law. He said, sin is there. Now, until the law was given, it was not what you see today. People didn't understand it. But sin is not imputed when there is no law. Sin exists. Romans chapter 7, starting in verse 7. So literally right before what we just read here. We picked up in verse 13 a while ago. Verses 7 and 12 here. So shall we say then, is the law sin? May it never be. Paul said, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. God's law is not sinful in nature. It exposes our sin. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For what I have not known about coveting, if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Paul said what it did was bring me to the realization that I was sinning. It did not make me sin. It did not make my life sinful. It just pointed out that I've got a problem. It pointed out the flaws in my life. And it pointed out the areas that I need to work on. Skipping down to verse 12, so then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and righteous, and good. So often those in the world, and even Christians at times, we have a problem with the law because we don't want to live up to it. God, you set your standard too high. I can never live up to this. I can never be what you expect me to be. God, it's not fair. How are you asking me to do this? Paul said the problem is not with God's law. It's with the way that we live. It's with us. He said the law is good, it's holy, it's perfect, it's righteous. So the sin, well, the law itself defines and reveals sin in our life. When we hold up our life as it compares to the law of God, we can then look, if we're honest with ourselves, and see where the sin issue is. And so can anybody else in the world. It defines that sin in our life. It reveals it to us if we're being honest with ourselves. We see that God, okay, I'm struggling with this. I don't read like I should. I don't pray like I should. I don't teach like I should. I don't go out and show the world like I should. God, I see the areas where I'm missing the mark. And at times it can cause us to create and provoke sin in our lives. Not because there's anything wrong with the law, but because of how we react to the law. See, our instinct is when we miss the mark, when we are not the people that we should be, when we do not live up to God's expectations, is either to blame somebody else or to hide it, both of which are sinful in nature. It causes us to sin. See, I don't want to stand here with all my sins laid bare to y'all. I don't want you to know where I struggle. I mean, that's nature, right? You don't want me to know where you struggle. Why do you think every Sunday morning the front pew is not full of people who are asking for prayers? Because we don't want the world to know we need them. We don't want the world to know that we missed the mark. So we hide. We run. We lie. That wasn't me. Look at Adam and Eve in the garden. Eve, that wasn't my fault. It's that serpent that you put here, God. You allowed him into the garden. It was the serpent's fault. Adam, it sure wasn't my fault. It was that woman that you gave me. So God, it was her fault. It was your fault. It wasn't my fault. I knew what the law was. You said don't eat, and if I do, I'll die. I know what you said, God. But it wasn't my fault. So I'm going to hide. I'm going to deflect. I'm going to blame somebody else. I'm going to run away. I'm going to do anything but admit that I am sinful. Romans chapter 7, starting in verse 8. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment. So through the law, through the commandment, sin taking opportunity produced in me coveting of every kind. Paul said, I wanted all this stuff. I wanted the attention of the world. I wanted the possessions. I coveted. For apart from the law, sin is dead. I once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive and I died. Paul said, I thought I was alive. I didn't realize I wasn't. But once I was exposed to the law, I realized that my spirit was dead. And I had to do something about it. And this commandment, which was to result in life, provided a result in death for me. Paul said, understand that the law is here so that we may have life, so that we can live with God, so that we can know what His commandments are, so that we can please God. But he said, it didn't do that for me. It showed me where my shortcomings were, and it showed me that I was dead. Taking an opportunity through the commandment deceived me, and through it killed me. If Paul stopped the letter to the Romans here at this point, it would be a sad, sad letter. But Paul doesn't stop here. Paul continues on with the idea of sin and how we can overcome it as Christians. And understand, first and foremost, where we talked about courage this morning and the courage where sin is involved, it is to confront sin in our own life. To deal with that plank that is in our eye before we go out and deal with the speck that's in somebody else's. So we have to have the courage to actually look at the law, look at our life, compare the two, figure out where we miss the mark, and then repent and move towards that righteousness, Move back towards God. Then, once we have applied that courage to our sin in our own lives, then we go out into the world and we say, look, I'm no better than you. I'm a sinner, but I have the answer. I understand how to deal with sin. Because if we leave it unchecked, sin will dominate our life. It will absolutely make us slaves, and it has at one point in time. Romans chapter 3, verse 9, what then? Are we better than they? Also, let me ask you a question here. We've got the law. We understand what it says. We have obeyed at times. Are we any better than those other people out there living outside of the law? Not at all. We have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. He said everybody out there is living under the law of sin and death. Everybody out there is living a life that is finite in time, and they will die, either with or without Christ. They're going to die physically. So Paul says we've got to address this. We've been made slaves to sin, and we have to deal with it in our life. There's one of two ways to deal with it. Either to leave it unchecked and let it continue to harden our hearts and to harden our life and to make us, well, I won't say immune, but just ignorant. Make us where we don't care. Make us where we don't realize it. Make us where we don't know. There are times in our lives where we just don't realize we're sinning. Not because we don't know what the law says, but because we have blinded ourselves to what we're doing in our lives. We've hardened our hearts. We can see it somewhere else, but we just don't see it in ourselves. Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12. Take care, brethren, lest there be any of you of an evil and unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. Now, it's been a while, but we spent a long time going through the book of Hebrews, line by line, word by word, and looking at it with the understanding that the primary message in the book of Hebrews is to hold on. Don't go back to that old law. Don't go back to Judaism. Don't go back to what you had before. You hold on to Christ. You hold on to the new law. You hold on to the blessings and the promises that He's given you today. And the writer of the book of the Hebrews here in chapter 3, verse 12 is warning us. And he's warning the ones that he's writing to in that day that I want you to watch out. Keep your eyes open. Take care, brethren, that there be not any of you of an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. Don't go back. Don't fall away from God. But encourage one another day after day as long as it's still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. He said the way you're going to go back to the world, the way you're going to go back to Judaism, the way you're going to go back to your old life, the way you're going to go back to living like you were before is that slow hardening of your heart. He said don't let sin do that to you. Don't let it take you down that path. Don't let it pull you away from the grace of God. Don't let it pull you away from His mercy. James chapter 1, verse 15. Then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. It's progressive in nature. When we allow sin to go unchecked in our lives and the lives of those we love, it is progressive in nature. That first little quote-unquote white lie that we tell. That first time we get caught with our hand in the cookie jar. That first time that we do something that just pricks our conscience for a moment. We leave it unchecked. Do it again. And again and again. No longer are we going to feel it. No longer are we going to struggle against it. No longer are we going to worry, how does this affect God? How does it affect my relationship with Him? How does it affect my family? Suddenly it's all about, what do I get? How do I get to live? What joy does it bring me? What momentary pleasure do I have? Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just though one man entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all have sinned. Again, sin is a disease. It's progressive. If we leave it unchecked, it will consume the entire world. I guarantee you, no matter how old you are today, if you look at your life and if you look at the world that we live in today, it looks different than when you were a kid. Sin is more evident than it's ever been before. Things that used to be considered just absolutely, we would never think about anybody talking about it in public. We would never think about anybody confessing it. We would never think about actually walking down the road or the sidewalk and saying it. Now it's everywhere. Because sin is progressing. People have forgot how to blush. And we've allowed it in this nation. We have stood by as the church for too long and said, I am going to take care of myself. I'm going to live my life. I might try and take care of my immediate family. But those out there, I can't deal with them. I don't have time. I don't have the strength. I don't have the energy. I don't have the courage to do it. And what we find today is if we don't do something soon, we've lost it. If you look around at the church, we've talked about this before. To a large degree, the church has lost a generation of people. You look around and you see the really, the ones that are progressed in life, the ones that older. Not bad, Pat. But we see the old and we see the young. Where do we see that generation in between? They're not here. Because we left sin unchecked in their lives. And we didn't tell them about it. We didn't love them enough to go out and say, I can't let you live like this. But there is an answer. God did not allow this to progress to this point without saying, I have an answer. God did not let Satan into this world without saying, this is the cure. God did not create us to be separated from Him. He said, I have provided an avenue where you can come back to me. No sin is so great that God does not want us in His presence. And no sin is so great that God cannot say, I forgive you. He's provided an avenue. And that's through Christ fulfilling the law. Christ said that He didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, to live it, to show us that it can be done, and to completely live out the law. Romans chapter 7, starting in verse 24. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So that on one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but the other with my flesh, the law of sin. Paul said, thanks be to God that Christ came into this world and gave us a second chance. He said, sin entered into our lives, and if we don't do something about it, it will separate us from God forever. But he said Christ has provided that avenue back. He has provided a means to come back to Him. For what the law could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, understand that. The law is weak because of us, because of the flesh, because we desire something else. God did, sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh as an offering for sin. I want you to think about that for just a minute. Christ came down, He looked just like us. He looked like sinful flesh. God in the flesh, He came as what? An offering of sin, or an offering for sin. That was His purpose for coming to this earth. His purpose for being born was to die. To die a horrible death so that you and I do not have to be separated from God, and so that nobody we love has to be separated from God. We just have to tell them. We have to show them. We have to have the courage to love them enough that we take that message to them. He condemned sin in the flesh, so that the requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And Paul gets to the point right there at the end. I mean, it's been all coming to this point right here. He said, if you want to get out from under the law of sin and death, if you want to live eternally with God, if you want to do His will, if you want to abide with Him forever, quit living in the flesh and live in the Spirit. Live according to that Spirit that God has given you. Christ came to this earth to live and die for you and me. to live and die so that sin could be abolished once and for all. He saves us from our sin. He saves us from being ourselves. He saves us from the consequences of a life that we chose at times, according to Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. He completely wipes away that sin. No trace of it anymore. We've talked about that beautiful image in the book of Revelation, where we were just black with sin. And that blood of Christ, that red crimson blood, washed us white as snow. We're told in Acts chapter 22, verse 16, that He washes away our sins. It is gone forever, and He covers them up through His sacrifice, through His blood. So that when God looks at us, we are found to be in the blood of Christ. We're no longer found to be sinful creatures. So at the day of judgment, He does not count that sin against us. There's no record of it. There's nothing to be counted, which frees us from the burden of sin. The burden of sin is death. It is separation from God. It is eternal damnation in hell. But Christ canceled that debt. He canceled our record of sin. And He cleanses us and forgives us continually. Sin is absolutely a horrible thing. There is nothing good that we can say about sin. The only thing good that can be said about it is there's a cure for it. There's an answer. There is a way to avoid the eternal consequences. That's through the blood of Christ. That's a message we have to have the courage to take the world today. We have to be willing to tell them that you've sinned, just like I have. Here are the sins in my life. You can see them. I'm not trying to hide my life from you. This is what God did for me. He removed the consequences of that. So I can stand here today and tell you He can do the same for you. If you need the prayers of the church, if you need to put on Christ in baptism, whatever your needs are, let's address them tonight as we stand and sing.